Welcome to Module 3, which is on tax policy and performance in Africa. In this topic, we will cover very important tax-related issues, such as trends in tax policy performance, the structure of the tax system and performance, tax policy reforms and their impacts, broadening the tax base, presumptive taxes on informal sector, African tax gap, tax policy challenges, and there is an optional section on tax compliance and tax evasion. On the first point, we would like to highlight some of the most important ratios that we follow for fiscal revenue purposes, and that is the tax to GDP ratio. In Africa, it is generally low. On average, for instance, for the last 18 years, it is in the range of 17% of the total GDP of the continent. I think if you look at figure 3.1, that is evident. And it is getting worse in some years. That means the tax collection effort is declining. We would like to also to discuss the reasons why this is the case. One of the major reasons is that most economies in Africa are informal. Therefore, many individuals and businesses are not in the tax net. And this has to increase. In terms of revenue, the revenue should increase if we manage to bring informality into the tax net. The second important reason is the administrative inefficiencies in tax collection. Therefore, there are a lot of policy changes that are needed and tax reforms that are needed to increase the tax revenue so that we can increase the tax to GDP ratio. And addressing these economic structural issues, service delivery and improving tax administration can also be important to boost tax revenue. In this slide, we will discuss the structure of the tax system and performance. Designing a tax system is very, very important. A good tax system sustainably raises revenue for government, and that will lead to better efficient delivery of services and also making the tax system fair. Therefore, constantly there is a revision of the tax structure and tax systems. In addition, the poor shouldn't pay a lot of taxes, otherwise it will be regressive and it will not be useful or even damaging for the welfare of households. Therefore, that's why there is a lot of discussion on the progressivity of taxation and also the regressive nature of some taxes. To understand tax burdens, there is an economic analysis that we do. It is called the tax incidence analysis. Therefore, whenever there is a tax introduced in a system, the tax structure and the tax burden and the tax incidence should be analyzed. The main components in terms of taxation are direct taxes and indirect taxes. And direct taxes include taxes on personal income and taxes on corporate income for companies. For instance, the payroll tax that you pay is a personal income tax, and it is directly referred to as a direct tax. And the burden is clear who is going to rest on. And in terms of property taxes, if you have equity, those taxes are also direct taxes. The indirect taxes are mostly associated with sales. Therefore, you have a VAT tax, a sales tax, a turnover tax, and tax on some transactions such as financial transactions, excise duties, and international trade taxes. And always economists make sure that the tax burden is fairly distributed to different economic agents, whether it is households and firms or companies. We also have a tax policy reform measure that is being taken by some countries to increase tax revenue in Africa. These are important because regularly governments introduce these reforms to adjust tax rates and also to make the tax base broad or broadening the tax base, as we call it. There are key reforms or key changes in the administration of taxes. For instance, integrating revenue collection responsibilities. If you have too many institutions or too many organizations or too many public bodies, too many government units trying to collect taxes, it is going to be very, very difficult for coordination. And in between, a lot of revenue will be lost. Therefore, many countries are trying to consolidate these different institutions into one. Therefore, they are instituting a single agency to collect taxes. And usually these are given a semi-autonomous revenue authority, and they are useful really to increase the administration better, the administration of tax collection better. One example is a reform that has taken place for the last decade at least, is the one in Ethiopia, which really adopted a very aggressive tax reforms, including the introduction of VAT and other taxes to broaden the tax base, at the same time also to improve the tax collection effort, in addition to making some changes technologically in the way the taxes are collected. In the economics literature, we have different analysis that is being done to show the effects of different taxes. For instance, based on Laffer curve literature, it is highlighted that excessive high tax rates can be very, very detrimental, because some governments think that raising tax rates is the way to increase the tax to GDP ratio, but it is not necessarily the case, because the literature indicates that expanding the tax rate exponentially or increasing it monotonically all the time is not always a guarantee to get a higher income or a higher tax revenue. Therefore, some countries, because of the insights from this literature, are reducing the tax rate, for instance, the corporate income tax rate. But there should be a limit how far you can go in terms of reducing the tax rate for corporations or multinational companies. So it shouldn't be used to avoid paying taxes. But at the same time, excessive rates of corporate income tax shouldn't be also imposed on companies and firms. Another important element of a tax reform is simplifying the tax system, because not many people really understand the tax system very well. This is mainly because many countries have big and large tax documents, and which are often very, very complicated. For that, Egypt has been at the forefront of really making some interesting and important changes in the right direction. That means simplifying the tax system, particularly which affects corporations or companies. And integrating tax systems is very important. But one may ask, what are the advantages? I think if you look at Africa 2019, you will find some interesting points which direct you to the merits and advantages of integrating tax systems. As I highlighted earlier, tax systems are complicated because when they were designed, the tax documents that are assembled to really design a system are very, very big, huge, and thousands of pages of documents about different components of taxes on goods and services and income sources. And this really puts a burden in the way the tax is collected and in the way tax is understood by taxpayers. And in between, there is a loss of potential government revenue that cannot be collected. Now, one of the efforts that we have seen in Africa is by many governments to broaden the tax base. At the beginning of our module or session, or even the course, online course in general, I said that The overseas development assistance, or the assistance that many African countries are getting from advanced economies, is declining. Therefore, they are really trying to broaden their tax base. They are also making an effort to raise domestic resources. And that was discussed under DRM, if you remember. But that is domestic resource mobilization. One way of domestic resource mobilization in a better way is to broaden the tax base. So governments are always looking for expanding their tax net and broadening their tax base. Sometimes they target companies through capital gains tax. Sometimes they target everyone, for instance, using VAT by just replacing some sales taxes. But at the same time, VAT sometimes can only be designed to be targeted at a certain number of individuals instead of just a broad-based one. Because if you apply VAT uniformly across the whole income distribution, you are affecting the poor as well as the rich or the middle class the same way, but you can really change it depending on the type of good or service that are being usually consumed by the poor. Therefore, you can really make it reasonably fair for the individuals who are earning less compared to others who can pay more. In recent years, for instance, East African countries, such as Uganda, have introduced very new taxes. And this is called the social media tax, which is pretty new. But it doesn't seem that it is well thought of, because that resulted in the number of internet users to decline. And it also really discouraged people from using mobile money transactions. Therefore, this might not be useful for the long-term economic development of that country or any other East African country which is thinking of introducing social media tax. So it might have a perverse effect on long-term economic development and also financial development or financial inclusion that we need for those who are unbanked and who cannot really use formal banks. Therefore, there is a pressure to get more revenue in Africa, but that shouldn't be at the expense of those who can really use social media or mobile money transactions, and that shouldn't be at the expense of the poor who cannot pay some uniform rate, such as a blind uniform application of VAT. So one good way of raising revenue is to collect existing taxes with better administrative efficiency, and even in the VAT system, it is better to administrate it fairly. Ask the rich more and ask the poor less. Some health-related taxes are also effective because we can really consider that, and that also broadens the tax base. For instance, tax tobacco taxation. In advanced countries, for instance, many governments are taxing very sugary or very sweet-based snacks heavily. They are also taxing fizzy drinks such as Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, and other sodas. And that is fair. And it is also important for the public health of the population. Now, I'll make some specific discussions or focus on the specific discussions of some important taxes that are being used by governments to bring more money into the government coffers. This is based on a recent study by Dubai. For instance, that study showed that presumptive taxes are used in Zimbabwe, and the study shows that they can be damaging. But the first question that you may have is, what are presumptive taxes? These presumptive taxes, as the name suggests, are based on presumed turnover or presumed income, and you have to pay whatever rate the government imposes on you. So these presumptive taxes are simplified regimes that are levied on not your actual income, rather it is just potential income. So someone will come to your premises and say, oh, this shop, you can pay $10,000 per year. or in that shop, no, you cannot pay that much, you just have to pay 1,000. So they are just based on presumptive perceptions of the total amount of turnover, sales, and income that you may get. Or they can be also a standard lump sum assessments paid by all individuals who are targeted. In this case, maybe minibus taxi operators, which the study by Dubey shows. Some presumptive tax designs have been implemented in the informal sector, some of which may be appropriate in taxing transport operators, as the study indicated. But if you want to get a very detailed discussion of the introduction of presumptive taxes and how they can be damaging, you can read the full text by downloading the article from the Service Industries Journal. And this is one of the journals that I have edited as a special editor when it was introducing some special issue topics on taxation and service delivery last year. One of the concepts that we said that we will discuss at the introductory part is tax gap. The first sentence in the slide gives you the definition of a tax gap. This is the difference between the amount of tax imposed by the tax regulation document or by a regulatory authority or the tax code and the amount that is reported as paid. Therefore, there is an amount that is imposed by the taxation authority, and there is an amount that is paid by the individual. If there is a difference between these two, the gap will be positive. So this gap can be calculated for each of the direct and income taxes we mentioned earlier. Therefore, it's not just a collection of taxes, it is just by tax types that you can really calculate this. In countries where economic agents don't report tax returns, I think the information on tax gap is not really going to be a reliable one. Therefore, there is always a measurement error in the gap calculation. However, one example of this challenge is VAT. Usually, escaping VAT might not be a feasible option. At a point of sale, you just pay it automatically as part of the price of the good or the service that you receive. Therefore, the tax gap might be limited. But at the same time, there are individuals and businesses who can really evade taxes, including VAT. Therefore, the gap is created for a variety of reasons. Some people, they just refuse to pay, and some people poor. In some cases, there is a poor collection of the tax itself by service providers, and there is a lack of administration of tax fairly, because we mentioned that you can really design VAT in a better way to make it fair. In terms of the report, Economic Report on Africa 2019, it shows that the power of VAT is there for Africa to exploit or to use, because some countries are really very, very late in terms of introducing value-added taxes or the VAT. Therefore, for the existing big tax gap of about half of the tax that is really presumed to be paid is not being paid as of 2018, given that gap, I think VAT can be used to raise some revenue and eventually to increase tax to GDP ratio, which is a ratio that we carefully monitor to increase the tax revenue of African governments, which they can use for development purposes. I think I have highlighted the last point. It is the equity element of the tax and its administration, and it should be given sufficient attention. So governments shouldn't just always go out and try to tax, but they should also make sure that it is fair. And also there should be a better administration of tax collection. In this slide, I will highlight some of the problems of African tax administration systems. And many African governments have limited tax to the GDP ratio because of the large informal sector. I think box 3.4 highlights that point. I want to add one interesting information in this regard. The informal sector, generally, just because it is informal, just because businesses are not registered, doesn't mean that it is a sector which really avoids paying taxes. In reality, our research indicates, based on the Afrobarometer survey, which surveyed many African countries in the past decade, we see that many businesses, many individuals are happy to pay taxes if services provided for them. Therefore, we can say that the size of the informal sector is a challenge, but at the same time, we can really leverage on the size just by focusing on how to support the informal sector and by providing the right public service for them or for those operating in that sector. And in that way, income can be raised from that sector too. Agriculture is another challenge because pretty much many African countries have a large agricultural sector, and many farmers are smallholders, and in terms of location, they are fragmented or they are dispersed as small-scale farmers. Therefore, for revenue authorities, it is not easy to follow up on a diverse set of farmers located in different parts of a given country to collect taxes. And it is also very difficult for tax authorities to assign a tax liability to farmers located in different locations because of the logistical problems. Another important challenge, maybe one of the most important challenges, is the issue related to land taxes. The land tax poses collection difficulties. It is very simple. You can really measure the size of the land that a family owns and impose a tax per square meter or per square kilometer. But there is a lot of problems in terms of data, in terms of who owns the data, who owns the land, and also the value of the land, and also the coverage of existing data sources of land properties. And there is also a huge problem associated with political interference because of the lucrative nature of land and land ownership. The political interference also interferes with efficient raising of taxes coming from land. The fourth challenge that we would like to discuss is associated with tax compliance. In many situations, taxpayers have a challenge to comply with tax authorities. In some cases, it is outright illegal activities such as tax evasion and capital flight. But in other times, as I mentioned, based on our study of Afrobarometer survey data in recent years, we found that tax compliance is not because of someone is just avoiding taxes and evading taxes. It is just because individuals, firms, companies don't feel that governments are giving them the right services, and they say, oh, if I don't get the right services, I will not pay. Therefore, to improve tax compliance, instead of chasing individuals and companies, we should also provide the services required by those individuals. Therefore, there will be more trust between government and individuals, between government and companies, and they will comply to tax demands. Otherwise, tax compliance cannot come easily. And just because we are chasing taxpayers, we cannot really expect to get a lot of compliance. But if we provide services, it will be tit for tat. Therefore, the trust will be there and tax compliance will be improved. The fifth point is a digital economy, which might really facilitate avoiding paying taxes. And this is highlighted in 3.6. And as we know now, the digital economy is expanding. Therefore, African governments have many, many tax policy challenges because of digitization. At the same time, it can also help to collect data quite easily because you can just trace the digital footprints of individuals and companies quite easily. Corruption affects tax administration. It affects tax collection. Therefore, if taxpayers are intending not to pay taxes, and if there is a tax official who is corrupt or who is ready to accept bribes, it may be difficult to really raise the required tax revenue for the government for development purposes. And the final point in this slide is already mentioned in the previous discussions that we had, is the tax that foreign companies are required to pay in Africa, which is becoming increasingly lower and lower. Therefore, there is a challenge for many, many African governments because each and every one of them are competing to attract foreigners by reducing corporate income tax, for instance. So the race to the bottom, which is leading countries to reduce taxes for foreign companies and compete against each other to attract investment, should stop at some point. So they should handle this completely carefully. In this slide, I will highlight some of the conclusions that we have arrived at from a tax compliance research. I feel this is very, very important and very fitting to our module, which is on tax policy and performance in Africa. And one of the conclusions that we came about is the need to provide public goods and services. In this, we mean the provision of roads, the provision of bridges, railways, and some infrastructure that can be used by private capital or private sector. Therefore, private sector individuals will be very happy to pay tax and to be compliant if there is a good provision of public goods and services. And this is the case in some Scandinavian and Nordic countries, for instance. So provision of public goods and services is one of the very important policy conclusions that we can arrive at. And public policy enforcement should also improve. So with that, a better collection of tax will lead to a better tax to GDP ratio. So the joint problem of provision of public goods and also enforcement of public policy are need to be addressed. The second conclusion is to use the provision of goods in such a way that it is equitable. Meaning, if you build roads, you shouldn't really build it along the way where your constituents are living. It should be for everyone within one national border. Therefore, it should be fair. And at the same time, if you are collecting fines and penalty money from companies and individuals who were evading tax, you can use that to provide public good in the economy, such as provision of roads and other infrastructure that is going to be useful for private sector. So all these policy conclusions that I mentioned to you are based on our analysis. It is not just based on observation. Okay, this will conclude module 3, which is tax policy and performance in Africa. And thank you for listening.